Good morning, afternoon, or evening to you all. Thank you for joining me. Today's lesson is just an introduction to critical thinking, some core concepts that will motivate us throughout the semester. We'll be working towards some official learning objectives, namely foundational skills to read, analyze, compare, and evaluate texts, identify premises and assumptions within texts, and then distinguishing between claims based on opinion and speculation, claims based on facts and reasoning, and more. We will learn more about all of these things to come. Today's work is just a general overview. Some of the topics that we're going to cover today are the concept of critical thinking, so the definition, relation to creative thinking, and a principle that critical thinking is a verb, something that you are always doing. It's changing, it's growing. It's not a noun in the sense that it's not like a fixed category or like a fixed skill that once you learn it once and you always have it. It's hard to articulate that idea, but we'll get to that. Another goal of today's lesson is sort of shifting the true false binary. So recognizing the gray area and the complexity, the differences between facts and assumptions, and a little bit of a toolkit to help us evaluate some ideas. And then why we value critical thinking. So kind of like the overall mission to use critical thinking in order to deconstruct, reconstruct, and generally just like shape our shared sense of reality. So as we get started, please take notes throughout the discussion. Please use the Canvas discussion board. You can pause the video and then use a reply into the Canvas discussion board to share like thoughts, ideas, or questions from each section. And in this class, we haven't yet introduced the concept of the note-taking ambassador. So for today, I would like everybody to do your best to take complete notes. Then look over your notes when this is finished, revise them and edit them. You won't turn them in, but I do want to start off the semester with strong note-taking skills. So with that in mind, let's begin. So first of all, what is critical thinking? Critical thinking is a mix between thinking, which is that purposeful mental activity. It's different from sensing, which is like involuntary. It's different from perceiving, which is sort of a cultural skill that we learn. It's about making inferences and making connections between the data. Thinking is sort of a middle ground between that. It's where we intentionally and purposefully focus our mental energies, just to break it down really simply. And then critique. Critique means to analyze something piece by piece and then assess it, evaluate it, or judge it based on criteria. It doesn't mean to criticize. So critical thinking isn't always about disparaging or insulting, although a lot of times once we get a foundational toolbox for critical thinking skills, we do often end up using them to criticize and disparage what we see as faulty, toxic, dangerous, or ineffective idea sets. So critical thinking is just thinking with the intention to critique. Altogether, it is to intentionally evaluate data that we perceive and also intentionally evaluate our own culturally conditioned processes of perception, inference, and assumption. So it is a broad, complex, and difficult to capture critical thinking as a whole. But we're going to lean into the complexity. We're going to lean into the layers. So in this class, we'll talk about those two themes a lot: complexity and layers. Moving forward, we want to think about the relationship between critical thinking and creative thinking. So we might be familiar with the idea of the left brain versus the right brain, where logic and analysis is a separate function from expression, imagination, and emotion. But actually, that's not a very productive or very accurate mindset. I'll share this quotation from Albert Einstein. Imagination is more important than knowledge, for knowledge is limited, whereas imagination embraces the entire world, stimulating progress, giving birth to evolution. And we can see this idea repeated through kind of like the most iconic critical thinkers throughout history. And one day when I have more time, I will get out my Gloria Anzaldua's book, Light in the Dark, and I'll bring in the quote that she uses to express imagination. It's a bit longer than what I can present on a slide. So let's look at imagination, trying to define the concept. Basically, we use imagination to develop new ideas, solve new problems, infer about hidden and ambiguous meanings. So inference is a huge part of our imaginative capacity. We can consider unfamiliar points of view. So seeing things through another person's eyes is, we already universally value that skill, and it's a capacity of imagination. Predicting the implications or predicting the consequences of thoughts and actions. When we look at this in conjunction to critical thought is often organized by like verbal, linear, logical structures. Critical thinking helps us organize our perceptions into meaningful connections, meaningful patterns, meaningful structures. And it helps us to really evaluate, judge, and critique things that already exist. So imagination helps us to develop new things to exist. Critical thinking critique helps us to evaluate what already exists. The core here in creative thought is intuitive and holistic and visual. It can be initiated through feelings, symbolic meaning, something that evokes a memory or an image in the mind. Creative thought helps us form new and unique content, structures, arrangements, styles, etc. So as I had mentioned in the previous slide, thinking about complexity, thinking about layers throughout the semester, we can kind of see how imagination is like the ultimate layer on like this, I guess, I want to say like an onion because I'm channeling like Shrek, like ogres are like onions because they have layers. But like this core where creative thought is kind of like our most basic human impulse. Critical thought is something that we can train to control and focus the impulses of our thinking. And imagination can hold both of those concepts. Next, we'll look at the idea that critical thinking is an action that we practice and develop, not a concept or an idea that we can just memorize and recite. So let's look at some critical thinking actions. Firstly, awareness. Critical thinkers are aware of their own thought process and in the thought processes of people that we read from, interact with, speak with. We sort of take what they say and we infer and we deduce the processes that have led them there. Awareness helps us to trace through moments of concentration, confusion, and clarity. So in our learning processes, we can pause and notice how we're responding to each thing that we're learning. Awareness also helps us to recognize and value disequilibrium. So disequilibrium kind of refers to the loss or the interruption of stability. Sometimes stability keeps us in our comfort zone, but when we use critical thinking, we start to see things from various perspectives. We start to dig a little bit deeper into the complexity and into the layers, and it could destabilize our steady course of assumptions. It could destabilize the things that we take for granted. So in a lot of ways that can be uncomfortable, but it can also be really empowering. So as critical thinkers, as we're going through our long learning process through college and then beyond, paying attention to moments where our taken for granted set of assumptions is challenged or questioned, or there's moments to grow and change, is one value, one practice that we can do as critical thinkers. Next, discipline. So these are things that we can train ourselves toward eventually. So critical thinkers are disciplined in that they can sustain deep and close attention, thinking about something for a prolonged period of time, dropping it and coming back to it. In our culture these days, critical thinking in that way, in sustained, prolonged attention, is not very well cultivated outside of the academic world. But we still expect adults and, citizens of the world to have this skill. So as critical thinkers, we need to be disciplined and train ourselves to have a sustained and deep, close attention. Another discipline of critical thinking is to persevere through distraction and boredom. This is something, especially if we are young adults, is something that is difficult. It's easy to become distracted, and it is certainly easy to become bored in the classroom and outside of the classroom. Critical thinkers question the information that they encounter. Critical thinkers don't just accept something as true at face value. Critical thinkers are skeptical. Critical thinkers confront difficult or complex moments of study. So if you're encountering something that's not just challenging because it's hard to understand, but challenging because it means that you have to persevere through sustained and deep attention. Critical thinkers confront complexity. We try to avoid oversimplifying things. We try not to see anything as black and white. We try not to see anything as universal. So confronting complexity instead of just ignoring it, instead of just avoiding it, which is so much easier. And then finally, some habits of critical thinkers. Number one, we can approach concepts, information, ideas, and topics from an inquiry mindset. So like a growth mindset. When we approach a topic, we kind of step into the room and say, okay, I acknowledge that I don't know everything about this topic, even if it's my major, even if I've studied it for 4 years. Always saying like, what can I learn? How can I grow? We can investigate the assumptions that are embedded in ideas. So when we hear an idea, we can kind of think a little bit deeper, questioning it, like, where does this idea come from? What value systems might this idea replicate or support? Critical thinkers regularly and consistently evaluate reasoning to see if it has mistakes or manipulations. So later in the semester, we're going to learn some concrete tools for evaluating reasoning. They're called like looking for fallacies and looking for rhetorical appeals. So critical thinkers use that toolbox of evaluation to look at how logic and reasoning is presented. Critical thinkers regularly develop sensitivity to the competing layers of meaning. So as critical thinkers looking at complexity, we're always going to look at the surface level of what is expressed, but we're going to look deeper beyond the surface at what is implied, what is suggested. We're going to use our imaginative faculties to say, I'm confronted with this idea, but what are the possible outcomes or the possible consequences of thinking in this way? And then, of course, the ultimate goal, why we're here in English 126, we want to be able to prepare valid arguments based on sound reasoning. So this is a lot to take in right now, all of these different habits. We are by no means trying to memorize all of this right now. We are not going to walk away from this lesson mastering any of these concepts. Our goal is to start learning, dipping our toes and dabbling with these concepts so that we can explore them more as we grow through not only this semester, but our future courses and our future areas that we engage with outside of the classroom. Pause the video here If you need to ask questions, make comments, share your thoughts. I'm especially interested in your views about what critical thinking is, how it interacts with imaginative thinking, and what kinds of habits you might be bringing with you as a already pretty developed critical thinker. So pause, and then when you're ready, we will move forward. The next thing that we're going to look at is destabilizing the true-false binary. Binaries in general, anything that sees a structure as either or, black and white. So we're going to start to begin learning some skills to navigate through contestable facts, multiple truths, and hidden assumptions. So we're continuing on with some more vocabulary that we're just beginning to explore and understand. So we might be familiar with the idea that a fact is something that is true, concrete, provable, and objective. Especially if we're coming from a mindset of like really valuing the scientific method for experimentation, we might kind of try to over apply those concepts toward pretty much everything. Always looking for objective facts. However, I would like to propose a different understanding that is more open to both objective and subjective truths. So it's kind of our dominant intellectual values in the West here, in the global North, are incredibly logocentric, meaning that we really seem to favor logic, reason, and proof as the supreme foundation of knowledge. However, recent trends have begun to re-acknowledge and re-recognize, to recognize. If you write that word down, it's really opens up a playful way to think about the structures of thinking and knowing. Anyways, recent trends in the past 20 years or so are really leaning into the idea that feelings, instincts, and intuitions can build valid forms of knowledge. So on the train of thought that we are re-acknowledging these things, we are recognizing these things, I like to put it in the context of rhetorical idioms of embodied knowledge. Like that the concept like, oh, trust your gut, go with your gut, that phrase dates back, a really long time. And it carries with it some of this wisdom, or like that you feel something in your bones, you know it to be true, that kind of concept. So overall, I would just like us as critical thinkers to understand that truth does compose logic. Cause and effect structures and outcomes can lead to true, real forms of knowledge. Compare and contrast, sequence and process analysis, all of these logical structures can absolutely help us build foundations of knowledge and truth. Proof in the form of conclusions based on premises, proof in the form of observable data, repeatable outcomes are absolutely key to the formation of truth and knowledge. But also feelings can lead us toward really meaningful foundations of truth and knowledge. If you feel joy because you've discovered some really valuable perspectives or some really valuable information, that feeling of like, this is positive, this is good, leads you to build that foundation of knowledge. Also feelings like frustration, something that's difficult to understand, or like a moment of disequilibrium where our previous assumptions are challenged and frustrated. Or if you're trying to express yourself and you're not being properly understood, these are avenues that can lead toward the construction of, valid knowledge. So moving forward, I'd like to share a quotation to kind of put this into context. This quotation comes from another expensive critical thinking textbook, one that I no longer use because I feel that most of the chapters aren't that useful. It's kind of out of date. Anyways, the quote: If you were to stand on a street corner and ask each passerby to define a fact, most would tell you that a fact is what is real and true. However, this notion is not entirely correct. Facts are only our interpretations of what is real and true, and sometimes these interpretations prove to be right, at least for a period of time, and sometimes dead wrong. Facts are not the equivalents to truths or realities. They are, at best, only our decisions about what seems most real. Human beings need facts because they need certainties in order to proceed through the world. But we should not forget that human beings are fallible. So either way, it sums up to mean that not much in the world can be seen as an absolute fact. Most knowledge is a matter of convention, a matter of habitual agreement over time. And this is empowering and kind of exciting to us as educated learners, because when we recognize the socially constructed nature of some facts, it allows us to evaluate and critique the claim that that is a fact. It also allows us to evaluate and critique the assumptions, values, and judgments that stem from asserting that this is true, asserting that this is a fact. It allows us to use our critical thinking to, evaluate and judge, and it allows us to use our imaginative thinking to ask what if and to probe into alternatives. So with that in mind, I'd like us to pause again, reflect. I know you're pressed for time and this is a long lesson, but do pause for a moment, sit with yourself for one moment, review, look at your notes, consider if there's anything you'd like to share in the discussion. And then when you're ready, we'll move on to the next portion of the lesson. The next thing we're going to look at is assumptions. So we're going to break it down again to understand the meaning, the morphology of the word. So to assume means to take. To assume means to accept or hold on to a concept without questioning it, without investigating or re-evaluating it. We can develop assumptions in a couple of ways, either by accepting ideas too quickly. So just jumping onto an idea without thinking slowly and deeply about it, or when we hold on to ideas for too long without reconsidering them. So assumptions that may have served us effectively, 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago. If we don't update that knowledge, there's a danger that these assumptions can become harmful. It's important to investigate and acknowledge and clarify our assumptions because they can have a significant impact on your judgments, your choices, your values, and the claims that you make about what is real, what is true, what is right, what is wrong, what should or shouldn't be. A lot of times our assumptions are unconscious. They are hidden or unconscious in the deep recesses of our minds. And a lot of times they do appear as stereotypes, which are dangerous because they fail to account for the complexities of real issues. Like looking at the word stereotype. Again, if you write it down, if you play with the morphology of that word a little bit, you have stereo, which is like the idea of like left and right. It's very black and white. It's very two-dimensional, which can never account for the real, true complexity of reality. Assumptions, unconscious assumptions appear as prejudice, where we prejudge something based on an assumption that we might not even know that we have. And most often assumptions appear as hasty generalizations, where we kind of just sort data into familiar categories, into familiar boxes, rather than looking at the boxes that we have, our assumptions. I have it illustrated as the bag at the top that we can sort things into. Instead of pausing and looking at our boxes from time to time, dumping them out and finding out where we need to discard something, or if we need to reorganize into a new box, or if we need to get a new box altogether, to make room for this unique, different, complex way of seeing. I'm trying to avoid using metaphors, but I feel like the boxing metaphor, the sorting metaphor, helps a little bit with this. Another key important reason to think deeply about our own assumptions, and not only our assumptions, but when we read something, when we converse with somebody, and we pay attention and become aware of their thought processes, and we use our imaginative capacities to infer what assumptions they must be carrying with them when they're making these concepts. It's important to do so because assumptions can be deeply embedded in our value and belief systems. Some of our most powerful assumptions are the hardest ones to recognize and the hardest ones to change. An unconscious accumulation of unexamined ideals influences our thought patterns, our judgments, our decisions, and our actions. These can be acquired through personal experiences, family expectations, social norms, cultural heritage, and historical contexts that should not be left unexamined. So basically then, assumptions are bad. Assumptions are like the worst thing you can do as a critical thinker. Once again, everything's not quite that simple. Everything's not quite that cut and dry. There is complexity. I'd like to share another quote. So assumptions have been described as the most dangerous form of knowledge. Why? Because assumptions carry with it unconsidered information, knowledge that is not subject to thought or critique. That therein lies the danger. However, assumptions just are a fact of life. We all have them, we rely on them, etc. The best thing that we can do as critical thinkers is to identify our assumptions and make them explicit. Assumptions aren't necessarily a bad thing. What is bad is when our assumptions remain unconscious, when our assumptions remain unconsidered and uncritiqued. So I'd like to share a little bit of tips and strategies for how we can evaluate ideas. So rather than seeing things as either true or false, as objective or subjective, we know that there's a complexity and we know that there is a blend. So I'm gonna introduce the sort of responsibility, the duty of critical thinkers to judge the quality of claims, facts, truths, and assumptions. And it can be difficult. It's an overwhelming and daunting task to be expected to always be thinking deeply, thinking critically, using criteria to judge the value of information. So today's lesson will introduce 3 general questions, and then we'll get into 10 specific criteria that we can use to begin this evaluation process. So the 3 questions are like what, why, and how. And so when we encounter a text, whether it's something we're seeing on TV, something we're reading, even a conversation, we just want to ask, okay, what is this text saying? What are the overt and direct statements, the surface level? Then once we comprehend the surface level, we can dig a little deeper. We can infer what the assumptions are. One way to do this is by analyzing the stance. So is it pro or con? Is it convincing me one way or the other? We can look at the tone. We can look at the content. So you can understand you can infer about the assumptions of what somebody says or what is presented to you by taking a minute to think about the details that are included in this text, in this commentary, in this media. So what is included? And then we use our imaginative critical thinking capacities to say, hang on, wait a minute, what was left out? What has been excluded from this statement? And then we can look at the support. So when we're understanding what the message is, like what is this message telling us, we can look at the details that support the message, like anecdotes, little stories. Maybe somebody's bringing in statistics. Maybe there's references to something. Maybe there's visual imagery. So understanding, again, as the core of this class, the layers and the complexities of what is this text made of? What is it showing me? What is it saying? So that's one way that we can evaluate the ideas. Another way that we can evaluate ideas is we can ask ourselves, why is this message being presented to me? Like, why is this speaker, this organization, this corporation addressing me? So we can infer the purpose of this text. Is the purpose of the text, does it seem like it wants to inform me about something? So is it reporting or documenting information impartially? And think about it. Is it intending to just state information? Are those statements impartial? Thinking back to the what content, like is something included, is something excluded? Perhaps there's a different reason. Maybe this text is trying to persuade, so to convince the readers to adopt an idea or take action. So trying to understand, what is this message? Why are they delivering this message? Or oftentimes, in these days, advertisement is the purpose of the message. A lot of times we see something that is really it's a persuasive or it's an influential purpose, but it's like dressed up or disguised as informative. So it's kind of like information with the intent to influence your actions, usually to buy something or to buy into something. So I like to add advertised as like a third way for like why information is presented. And then finally, how. So what is this message telling me, using my deeper thinking to infer the layers? Why are they telling me this? Like, what do they want out of me? And how is it being presented? So when you're evaluating ideas, you can critique the style of the text. And again, whether it's something you see in the media, something you read, or something you're just like a conversation with somebody. So critiquing the style. So how are they using language to communicate? Is it explicit, clear, and direct? Do we see a lot of figurative language? Do we see a lot of suggestive wording? Is it generalized and vague? So these different labels, different ways that you can, like label and understand the style. And then we can think about the tone as well. Is it sincere or ironic? Is it impartial or biased? Is it emotional or detached? And then that difference between appearance and reality. Does it appear sincere, but it's actually manipulative? So that difference between, I guess, like I said before, like the surface level and then like the deeper level. The presentation, the expectation, and then the true reality. And then also the critiquing the style, critiquing the perspective that they're showing to you. Are they showing you something that's balanced, or are they showing you something only from one side, only from one angle? So 3 questions, what, how, and why, and then we'll take a look at 10 specific criteria. So the criteria are, these might be familiar to some of us, but as with everything in this class, we're building upon our previous knowledge. So firstly, is it relevant? So is it really connected to this topic without being distracting? Is it complete? So does this idea consider complex layers of meaning, or does it oversimplify? Is it fair? So does it acknowledge various perspectives without bias? Is it impartial? Is this information accurate? So is it presented without lies, distortions, and manipulations? Is it precise? So does it include specific, exact detail, or is it vague, generalized? Is it clear? So when you are presented with this information, is it concise and simple and direct? Or Does it use overly technical language or confusing structures? Is it transparent? So can you openly verify the sources of information? Are information sources ethically cited and ethically credited? Is it current? So does this idea, this is a big one, does this idea reflect recent debates, recent views, and changing developments? And finally, is it sound? Meaning, is it free from fallacious logic or fallacious reasoning? I'll take a reminder here to just remind us all that we are not expected to master the concepts, either from those three general questions with their multiple layers or these 10 specific criteria. At this point in the semester, we are just getting warmed up. We're going to learn how to apply and practice and master some of these concepts through active practice throughout the sustained duration of the semester. So we're not going to understand all of this right now. So with that in mind, we can pause and remember that we need to use our critical and creative thinking to understand, infer, and evaluate ideas. We're digesting a lot today, so pause here, share questions, comments, ideas, glance down at your notes, take a moment of stillness, glance down at your notes, see what you've got, and then when you're ready, we can move forward. So the last concept in this lesson is why we value critical thinking. Those habits of critical awareness and discipline give us the tools to understand the world independently, to participate in the construction of meaning and the construction of value from an authentic and self-directed standpoint. So really, critical thinking is a tool for empowerment. Evaluating facts, truths, and assumptions allows us to determine for ourselves which ideas we will accept and what meanings we will make of them. So again, there's like kind of a tripartite structure of how we can interact with and engage with ideas, kind of along the framework of agree, disagree, or somewhere in between. So building upon the agree, disagree, both, we're going to use new, more advanced vocabulary. So one way that we can engage with ideas and meaning is to assimilate those ideas and that meaning. In other words, we can choose whether we wish to understand an idea by using already existing widespread sets of common cultural codes. So going back to our previous metaphor, does it serve us well to use our pre-existing boxes to sort and categorize ideas? When we are choosing to assimilate with an idea, we're kind of saying that this idea conforms with and perpetuates dominant representations, dominant codes, dominant structural relations or values. And that's not always a bad thing. It's neither good nor bad. Whether we accept, reject, or negotiate between ideas is not good or bad. It's just a different way to engage with those ideas. One way that we might be familiar with the assimilation engagement is through the idea of like the sympathetic reading or reading with the grain, reading for what you can accept, reading for what you want to take forward with you. So another way to engage with information is to resist it. This is like disagreeing. This is like rejecting an idea. So when we resist ideas, we are actively criticizing that idea. And oftentimes we are actively criticizing the value structure that is associated with that idea. So using our critical thinking to look at the layers of the surface content, the assumptions, the implications, and criticizing the values about gender, ethnicity, economic relationships, environmental policies, or other kinds of human identity. When we resist an idea, we actively undermine or deconstruct the hegemonic or the dominant, the ideological views And we do so by arguing in favor of alternative codes of understanding. So we don't just dismantle something that we reject, we recreate that context in a way that serves us and serves our value structures. We might have heard of this not just as disagree or reject, but the oppositional reading or reading against the grain, taking a skeptical and antagonistic stance toward the ideas that we're encountering. And then finally, the negotiate. This is the mixed response. The I agree and disagree. I neither agree nor disagree. So when we're negotiating through an idea, which is it's the most common way to respond to an idea, we can concede to or we can acknowledge some of the strengths or some of the merits of that ideology, some of the benefits of those common cultural codes. But we can also expand or alter those existing codes so that they can integrate and suit multiple possible expressions. A lot of times this helps us to update ideas, to equitize ideas, taking into account more contemporary value structures. When we are negotiating the ideas, acknowledging the benefits and also critiquing the downfalls so that we can propose different changes, we often want to emphasize that multiple groups of people interact with and relate to dominant traditional norms in a variety of ways. We generally seek to question the problems with these traditional norms, to suggest alternative solutions, and ultimately transform our way of thinking. It's not an either or mindset. So it's not the binary thinking of like left brain versus right brain, truth versus falsehood. It is an also and. It's a both type of mind frame. It's a third way that negotiates and navigates between the kind of like more rigid structures of assimilating to the dominant norms or outright rejecting them altogether. So with those kinds of complicated and sophisticated new vocabulary for talking about whether we agree, disagree, or somewhere in between, let's move on to our final concept for today's lesson. The empowerment of critical thinking to shift our sense of reality. I'd like to share a quotation by Paulo Freire from 1978. This is kind of like a sacred text in the humanities discipline. I'll share the quote. Education either functions as an instrument which is used to facilitate integration of the younger generation into the logic of the present system and bring about conformity, or it becomes the practice of freedom, the means by which men and women deal critically and creatively with reality and discover how to participate in the transformation of their world. So a beautiful example of compare and contrast logical structure, but also just a beautiful philosophical standpoint that I invite us all to think about and use as we journey into spring 2025 semester together. So no. In all reality, the critical thinking that we do here in our English 126 class at DVC ultimately probably will not change the world. But in this class, our deep thinking about real world issues will give us time and space to critique problems and suggest creative solutions. Sustained questioning, researching, and argumentation will help us all develop a starting point for participating in those issues in a way that is meaningful to you. I guess I should wrap this up. We have a little bit of follow-up. Please share questions and comments in the discussion below. And don't forget your homework. We have a reading annotation and a response writing, and also start ordering your textbook. All right, thank you guys. I'll see you on Tuesday.